Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. This is your brother Abdurrahman Bashir. And today we are going to talk about the month of Rabi Al-Thani. For those of you who looked out your window yesterday around Maghrib time, and also the night before and last night, you would have noticed that now we are in the month of Rabi Al-Thani. So hence we are going to talk about the month of Rabi Al-Thani. We're going to talk about some important events that happened in the month of Rabi Al-Thani. And as I have promised, as a habit every single week, I share my notes and my research with you in the form of a PowerPoint. So inshallah, we will go ahead without further ado. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So Rabi Al-Thani is actually the fourth month in the Hijri calendar. Today's topic is the early days of Medina after Hijrah. So as I spoke about in a 4-part series last month, the month of Rabi al-Awwal is known for many significant events, including the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, including the departure of the Prophet ﷺ, and sandwiched in between that, his actual entrance and settling into the city of Medina. So following the month of Rabi al-Awwal, a lot of things unfolded. Rabi al-Thani is known for a lot of significant events, but we're going to go ahead and start off with the Prophet ﷺ's early days in Medina. So let's set up this stage. We got this. All right, so today's discussion. Today we are going to talk about his stay at the house of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari radiyallahu ta'ala an. Now, if you caught us in the last episode, when we were talking about, last month in one of the episodes, one of these sessions, I talked about how the Prophet ﷺ's camel the reins were left loose and it decided to park itself and stop right in front of the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu. But we didn't get into much detail about his stay. Now we are going to talk about that. We are also going to talk about the construction of the Prophet ﷺ's masjid. It is in the latter part of Rabi al-Awwal, the early part of Rabi al-Thani, when the construction, the building of the Prophet's mosque started. And another thing that unfolded when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina is many Jewish scholars, many rabbis, the ulama of the Yahud, who had migrated over the years, over the decades, in anticipation to welcome and receive the Nabi of the end of times, the Nabi Akhiru Zaman. And so they all, a large group of them, many of them came to visit and meet with the Prophet ﷺ. So these are the 3 things we're going to talk about tonight, inshallah. Before we get into the house of Abu Ayyub radiallahu anhu, the month of Rabi', okay, we talked about this actually in the month of Rabi al-Awwal, but just to refresh your memory, the month Rabi', right? The word Rabi' comes from the root word Ra, Ba, and Ain, which means to wait, to stop, okay? And it also means to kind of get fattened up and bloated. So Safar, as we know, Safar was the first month after the sacred months of Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hajj, and Muharram. And then there's another month, Rajab, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So as soon as the sacred months were over, fighting would start, battle would start, war would start. So they would resume. After 1 month of battling, they would take a break and stop. And when would that be? That would be the month of Rabi', the month of stopping, and because they stopped, it would give their animals a chance to graze and fatten up, okay? Now, as far as English is concerned, the word Rabi' is translated as spring. Now, when we think about spring, I know we're in fall right now, but when we think about spring, what happens in spring? The weather usually turns warmer, trees begin to grow, farmers and gardeners, they begin to work on the soil, they begin to plant their seeds, and overall the earth comes back to life again. Now, when we talk about spring, in the early part of spring is usually when the winds pick up and the rains pick up. Farmers kind of hustle to get crops into the ground. And then what happens in the second half of spring? That's when the trees start to grow and reproduce, crops start to sprout, flowers start to bloom. So in general, when you have that type of situation, that calls for you to kind of hold off your travel plans, focus on what you have, focus on your land. So in the Islamic calendar, we have 2 months that would represent the spring season, Rabi Al-Awwal and Rabi Al-Thani. So what is Rabi Al-Awwal? That's the month when the wind and rain kick in, and then the second Rabi' would be when things would start to sprout and things would start to blossom. There's a saying in English: March winds and April showers make way for sweet May flowers. So likewise, Rabi al-Awwal, Rabi al-Thani, I did mention last month in the opening of Rabi al-Awwal that the naming of the months does not reflect the actual season because of the lunar cycle that our calendar follows. Okay, so going into our discussion, the Prophet ﷺ enters Medina. Everyone wants to host the Prophet, including the Prophet's own uncles, Banu Najjar, who lived in Medina. Anyways, the Prophet ﷺ kept on making this announcement: "Khallu sabilaha," don't stop the camel. فَإِنَّهَا مَأْمُورَةٌ, it has orders from God. It will stop where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands it to stop. Now, close to Qaswa, the Prophet ﷺ's camel finally reached an area, a neighborhood of the Banu Najjar clan, and it stopped at a spot that was right in front of the home of a person named Khalid ibn Zayd. Who was Khalid ibn Zayd? Also known as Abu Ayyub radiyallahu anhu, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He was the host of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As soon as the camel put itself in park and put its neck on the ground, immediately Abu Ayyub radiyallahu anhu grabbed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saddle and then took it to his house. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam humorously replied, "Well, a man must follow his saddle." And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went along, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam honored Abu Ayyub Ansari by accepting his invitation and being his guest. Now, when we talk about the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari, now obviously we are 1442 years after the fact. So this circle, this orange marker in this picture right here, this indicates the approximate location of where the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu ta'ala anhu was. All right. Now, Abu Ayyub Ansari radiyallahu anhu, through his hospitality, we are going to learn his respect for the Prophet, his love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his second to none hospitality. Now, the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari was actually double-storied. It had 2 floors. Now, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he chose to stay downstairs, but Abu Ayyub Ansari and his wife, they both felt very embarrassed, to be upstairs, to be on top, on the top level above the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They found it, they felt embarrassed out of sheer respect and honor for their guest. Now, what was the thought process on the other side? Well, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam felt that, look, I'm staying in Medina. People are going to frequently come and meet me. It's going to disturb his family, so I'll stay in the ground floor, and that way people can come in and out without bothering Abu Ayyub and his wife. Now, during the course of his stay, Abu Ayyub radiyallahu anhu, he would send meals to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam twice a day. Now, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would eat whatever he wanted to eat, and what was left over, Abu Ayyub and his wife would eat anything that was uneaten and left over by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they would look at the plate. They would look at the bowl or the plate to see where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's fingers touched, and they would eat from that exact spot as a source of blessing. So this shows the love that Abu Ayyub and his wife had for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, how much respect did they have? One night, now there are two stories that in particular about his stay at Abu Ayyub radiyallahu anhu's house. One night they couldn't sleep. They passed the whole night sitting in a corner, and then the next day Abu Ayyub came up to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, "Ya Rasulullah, we couldn't sleep at night. We sat the whole night sitting in the corner." And when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked them for the reason, he responded, "May our parents be sacrificed for you. We always remain thinking that we are committing disrespect to you. Last night, this feeling grew to the utmost and we could not sleep." Subhanallah. So look at the respect that they had for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, I mean, in we may not consider it a big deal if we have a home that has a guest room downstairs and we host our guests downstairs. We have our master bedroom if we have a two-story house, or in our homes we have the bigger room. A guest room tends to be a smaller room. So out of the utmost respect, thinking that we are above the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we are kind of coming in between where revelation is descending. They felt this. They felt this as a disrespect, and not just, okay, it's disrespect, but it did not allow them to sleep. And they actually addressed this concern to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they pled with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to have mercy on them and kindly shift upstairs. Then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam agreed, and he moved upstairs. Now, before I tell you about the next story, these are some pictures that I had managed to find. Till not long ago, the actual area and structure, a residence remained where Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu's house was. Right there in the red triangle, you can see the green dome, which indicates the house of Aisha radiallahu anha, which indicates the resting place of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you can see the close vicinity, okay, between both of their houses. Abu Ayyub Ansari and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam were neighbors, literally neighbors. Now, Abu Ayyub radiallahu anhu, there's another story that on one cold, it was a cold night and some water spilled on their floor. This is while the arrangement was where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was downstairs. Now, they slept under one blanket and now the water spilled. So what did they do? They took their blanket to mop up the water so it doesn't seep through the roof, the floor, and go and inconvenience or drip on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And because of that situation, now they had to use their one and only blanket to get the water together, and now it left them cold the rest of the night, right? So, I mean, on top of the embarrassment that they felt and then the disrespect that they felt, they asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that, please, we would like you to stay upstairs, upstairs in the loft. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was not inconsiderate or adamant on staying downstairs. If this is the wish of the host, then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam agreed to it. And this also shows, the frankness and the openness that they had with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, apart from the fact that they did not want to continue to feel embarrassed by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam being downstairs. All right, here's another picture for you. Daru Abi Ayyub al-Ansari bil Madinah al-Munawwara. So this is, again, so by the way, there was a dome over the house a dome was erected over the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari as a marker, as an indication of his house. Now, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how long did he stay at the house of Abu Ayyub radiallahu anhu? He stayed at the house of Abu Ayyub radiallahu anhu for almost 7 months, until Masjid An-Nabi was completed, okay? And then after the masjid was completed, there were rooms that were made for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his household. When they were built, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he shifted over. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as I mentioned before, Abu Ayyub radiallahu anhu and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam were neighbors, and what a noble neighbor to have. I mean, being a neighbor of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is an opportunity that is second to none. Subhanallah. Now, Abu Ayyub Ansari continued to love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with all of his heart, and he loved him very dearly. And as neighbors, as close neighbors, as the host of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for 7 months. They definitely developed a closeness for each other. Another picture, another overhead shot. Now, this is obviously a very old shot. This is, way before, the any expansion that we are familiar with today. So you see that, the green dome, and then right adjacent to it, that dome where the 2-story residence of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu ta'ala anhu used to be. Okay. What else happened in the early days after Hijrah? As I mentioned, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the first things the first tasks that he got off the ground was to designate and dedicate and erect and construct a place where they can collect, they can gather, they can congregate. So the function of a masjid, it was not, even though the word masjid means a place to do sujood, but the function, the definition of a masjid was much more broad than whatever whatever may come to our mind in regards to what a masjid is. Okay, now we're going to talk about the construction of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's masjid. So right opposite the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu, there was an open land that was used to dry dates. Now, on this land were a few trees, there was a couple of graves, and a resting spot for the herds of cattle. Not nerds of cattle, but herds of cattle, okay? Now, this was the same area that Qaswa had sat on when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina. So as I shared earlier in one of the previous sessions, Qaswa came into the neighborhood, she sat down, she got up, moved forward, turned back around, came back to the exact same spot, sat down, and put it in park. So that became the area. So that piece of land that she sat down on, okay, that was an empty piece of land. So the Prophet ﷺ inquired about it. Who is its owner? The Prophet ﷺ was told that this piece of land, this plot of land, actually belongs to two orphans. Okay, what were their names? Conveniently, Sahal and Suhail. Their parents had died. The uncle was taking care of them, and this was their property. This was what they had. Now, when the boys heard that the Prophet ﷺ was interested, like he was inquiring about the land, they just went ahead and said, Ya Rasulullah, take it. Just take it. But the Prophet ﷺ, he insisted that no, he is not going to take the land. And then the Prophet ﷺ paid them and purchased this land. Okay. Now, what happened after the Prophet ﷺ purchased the land? Well, the construction started. How did the construction happen? Well, the Prophet ﷺ ordered the date trees to be cut down. So there were a few date trees that were on that property. They were cut down. The two graves that were there, they were dug up and relocated. There were a number of dead trees. They were also cut down. The ground was leveled and the foundations were laid. So now after the ground was leveled, it was dug, the foundation was laid. The Prophet ﷺ himself, with his own spear, marked the boundary, okay, using the tip of his spear. Okay, this is going to be the masjid. Okay, what happened next? Well, the Prophet ﷺ asked all the Sahaba to join together, okay, and work together in building the mosque. And the Prophet ﷺ himself joined the builders. He worked hard right alongside them. And because the Prophet ﷺ worked alongside them, the Sahaba, this encouraged the Sahaba. There's a lot of, there's some poetry that is also mentioned. And the Prophet ﷺ would actually pick up the bricks that were used, and he would pick up so many that he would have them lean against his chest, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the building material that was used for the Prophet ﷺ's masjid, okay? So get a load of this. There you go. So what were the building materials that were used for the Prophet ﷺ masjid? The walls were made of unburnt brick. What does unburnt brick mean? That means when you take the clay, you mix it up with the water, you create the shape of brick, and you let it just dry out in the sun. Now, when you fire the brick, it becomes stronger. This was just dried, air dried by the sun. So you have these unburnt bricks that were used to build the walls of the Prophet ﷺ's masjid. What about the ceilings? The ceilings were made of stalks of the date trees. Now, we're talking about a ceiling, okay? This ceiling did not prevent rain from leaking through, okay? What about the flooring? Well, there was no special flooring. There were a few mats that were laid down, but it did not cover the whole area. Most people just prayed directly on the sandy floor. I know if you are visiting the masjid nowadays, with COVID going on, you're taking your sajada, prayer rugs are back in. All of those prayer rugs that were given to us by any and everyone coming back from Hajj and Umrah, we are all cashing in on those sajadas now. And when we go visit the masjid, communities, they get together to make sure that the carpet in the masjid is nice, it's plush, it looks nice, it's the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when we talk about the Prophet's masjid, it did not start off, definitely did not start off what we see today, especially. Now, the Prophet ﷺ's masjid was a square building, okay? And believe it or not, you should know, the Qibla was actually facing towards Masjid Al-Aqsa, towards Jerusalem, okay? And this is the direction that Muslims had been praying towards and continued to pray, even in Masjid An-Nabawi, for another 17 to 18 months, okay? So this is, now, by the way, this structure that I showed you right here, this is just a model of how the Masjid An-Nabi was imagined, okay, based on the description that has been given by historians, the records that were researched, and based on, you know, the material. This is an imagined layout of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's masjid. So you see, as I mentioned in the last slide, the Qibla was facing towards Masjid Al-Aqsa. So back then, it was oriented north-south, okay? The Qibla was towards the north, okay? Makkah is south of Medina. So the Qibla wall was towards the north, towards Masjid Al-Aqsa. And the As-Suffa was along the south wall. What is As-Suffa? I'm going to get into that, okay? So we see the Prophet ﷺ's masjid, the model. So north side, that's the Qibla wall. Now, there was a ceiling made of date stalks, right on top, but it didn't cover the entire masjid, okay? So most of the masjid was open-aired, like open-aired courtyard format, which a lot of masjids, not too many masjids in America per se, but if you go overseas, you'll have, the main musalla area, and then there's a huge area considered as the courtyard. Some of them have, a hawd, like a little, a spring or a pond where people do wudu in, whatever the situation may be. So this is how the Prophet ﷺ's masjid was open air. And then you see where the S's were the south. That is what a Suffa was. What was a Suffa? A Suffa was a shelter that was available at the rear of the masjid during early Islam. Now, many of the muhajirin that came, not all the muhajirin, there was this period of time where before the migrant Sahaba were paired up with the Ansari Sahaba, and not just that, the ones who could not be paired with other people. So people who were homeless, people who did not have a home, they did not have enough money. This is kind of where they started off from, okay? This was where they transitioned from. We'll learn a little bit more about Ashab al-Suffa at a later time. But for right now, the area designated to serve as a shelter for the Sahaba who needed a place to stay and who needed a place to eat and be with others was known as the As-Suffa. And this was right at the back of the masjid. There was a little ceiling, an awning over their heads as well to protect them from the shade. It is mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, whenever he would get like dates from sadaqat, any sadaqat, the Prophet ﷺ would bring it and he would share it with the Ashab al-Suffa, and then he would also, the Prophet ﷺ would also sit down and eat with them. Okay, so this is Ashab al-Suffa. Now, the Prophet ﷺ's homes, you see the arrow right there. These were the homes that were built right along the south wall of the masjid. Now, when we say home, we think of what? Living room, dining room, kitchen, couple of bathrooms, couple of bedrooms, maybe possibly a garage. Okay, maybe not a garage, but whatever. When we think of a home, we think of a structure with multiple rooms. But when we talk about the home of the Prophet ﷺ, we are talking about a simple hujra, a room with an entrance, a room with a wall leading to another room, okay, with an entrance. So this is how the setup, this is how simple the setup was of the Prophet ﷺ and the Prophet ﷺ's household. Now, at the time, there were only 2 rooms made for the Prophet ﷺ, one for Sauda radiallahu anha and one to house Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha. So initially it started off with 2 rooms and then it kept on expanding as the need, as was needed. Okay. So as I mentioned about the Prophet sallallahu, the construction of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's masjid, the roofed area was towards the front. Okay. It was made of palm tree branches, cemented together by beaten clay. It was slightly sloped to facilitate drainage during the rainy season. So they didn't just slap things together. They thought it through as much as they could, and it was slanted. But remember, did not stop rain from getting in. Okay, majority of the courtyard was left open as I mentioned. Now, what happened after 18 months when the Qibla went the other way? What did they do? Did they rebuild the masjid? Did they break the walls down? No. All they did was they swapped the roof. They took the roof and they moved it to the back wall, and the Ashab al-Suffa shelter, that portion of the roof, they flipped it towards the north wall. And so when Masjid An-Nabi first started off, the Prophet ﷺ's residence was by the south wall, by the non-Qibla wall. And then after 18 months, when the Qibla was flipped and the roofs were flipped, now the Prophet ﷺ's residence is right in the front at the Qibla wall of the masjid. So this is how the flip happened, in the Prophet ﷺ's masjid. All right. What is something else that happened when the Prophet ﷺ entered Medina? Well, the delegation or groups of Jewish scholars, also known as rabbis, they came to meet the Prophet ﷺ. Now, why did they come to meet the Prophet ﷺ? Well, we know from Sirah that the Jews of Medina were well aware of the coming of a prophet. Okay, they knew that, and this is why the Jewish tribes, and inshallah, at one point I'll give you the makeup and the demographic of the different communities that lived in and around Medina. You have Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayza, then you have the Aus and the Khazraj, and how they were situated and where their neighborhoods were. So the Jewish community had done a migration to, at that time, was known as Yathrib. Why? In anticipation to welcome a prophet who would come before the end of time. Okay, so they were well aware of this fact. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ arrived and settled down, the rabbis, they convened a meeting to decide on visiting. Hey, that prophet's here. Let's go visit. And obviously, it's not like they were unaware of the fact that he was in Mecca for all these years, 12, 13 years. The Quraysh did consult with the ulama of the Yahud, with the rabbis, to see, how they can, what tactic they can use to stump the Prophet ﷺ. And this is the backdrop of Surah Al-Kahf. They came up to the rabbis in Medina, in Yathrib, and at that time, and they said, hey, give us something that we could ask to stump and to see if he's, to stump the Prophet. And they said, okay, ask him about. And then Surah Kahf was revealed that addressed the issue of Dhul Qarnayn, addressed the issue of the seven sleepers, and addressed the issue of the Ar-Ruh. Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ came. The rabbis decided, okay, let's go and let's put these questions. Let us put this person to the test. Okay, and they knew what to ask because they asked questions that only a prophet would know the answers of. Okay, once a rabbi visited the Prophet ﷺ as he was reciting Surah Yusuf, and as he heard Surah Yusuf, he immediately recognized it to be revelation, and he said that this is just like the revelation that was sent to Musa alayhi salam. Okay, he went back and then he brought another group of rabbis who heard the same and accepted Islam. Okay, now, how did I mentioned that the Jews knew about the Prophet ﷺ. How do we know that the Jewish community knew about the Prophet ﷺ coming? Well, one of the incidents or one of the events that we, from what we understand, the knowledge of the Jewish community was, well, the Ansar, right? When the Ansar came to the Prophet ﷺ, when the Prophet ﷺ met the Ansar for the first time during those days of Hajj, okay, a couple of years before the migration started, 3 years before the migration started, when the Ansar would talk amongst themselves, they would say that, oh, this is the prophet that the Jews would mention about in front of them. Well, now, what does that mean? So there was a lot of warfare, battle, and tribal wars in Yathrib before Islam came around. The Aus and Khazraj were constantly at each other. A lot of their fighting were instigated by the Jewish community. Even the Jewish community in Yathrib were at each other's throats. They weren't. It wasn't like the Jewish community against the Aus and the Khazraj. It was all a hodgepodge. It was a mix. They all had strifes against each other. And when we study more about Sirah, we understand how they backstabbed each other at one point as well. So whenever they would have these fights, they would threaten the Ansar by saying that, you know what, when that prophet comes up, we're going to kill you, right? We are going to be victorious over you when the prophet shows up. So they kept on hearing this. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in an ayah in the Quran, وَكَانُوا مِن قَبْلُ يَسْتَفْتِحُونَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُم مَّا عَرَفُوا كَفَرُوا بِهِ. Before they used to يَسْتَفْتِحُونَ, they would seek or anticipate fath through the prophet against the disbelievers, meaning the people in Medina who were not from the Ahlul Kitab, who the Ahlul Kitab considered to be the pagans, the Aus and the Khazraj tribes. And then فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُم مَّا عَرَفُوا, then when finally the person who they recognized came along, كَفَرُوا بِهِ, they ditched him. They disbelieved him and the message. So the Ansar, when they met the Prophet ﷺ, and now they're putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, aha! So he is the prophet that the Jews always talk about. So from this we understand that, prior to the Prophet ﷺ actually entering Medina as a prophet, even before that, there was always this anticipation from the Jewish community to be there to welcome a prophet nonetheless. One of the first rabbis to visit the Prophet ﷺ was Yasir ibn Akhtab. He was the brother of the leader of the Banu Nadir tribe, Huyay ibn Akhtab. After meeting with the Prophet ﷺ, Yasir was convinced about its truthfulness and its veracity, and he expressed what he felt about it with Huyay. But Huyay, being the leader of the tribe, he decided that, no, I'm not going to, and just simply out of animosity and hatred and jealousy, that he did not allow that message and that the sentiments of his brother Yasir to move forward. Now, who is Huyay ibn Akhtab? Well, you fast forward 5 years from that time, and we are in the battle of Khandaq, okay, the battle of Ahzab, the trench. What was this battle? Well, it was an alliance that was formed along with Quraysh and many of the Bedouin tribes in between Mecca and Medina, and they were also allied with the Jewish community, Banu Nadir of the from Medina. Okay, the person who orchestrated the entire Ahzab battle, in which the city of Medina was laid under siege for 28 days. By how many? By an army of 10,000 strong. Who orchestrated all of this? It was Huyay ibn Akhtab. Who was Huyay ibn Akhtab? He was the leader of the Banu Nadir tribe. The Prophet ﷺ had approached Banu Nadir to, it was a test of their loyalty as well, because they had allied and there was some blood money that needed to be taken care of. And the leaders of the Banu Nadir tribe, they expressed their involvement in helping the Muslim community. And then behind the Prophet ﷺ's back, they decided to, let's throw a boulder and call it a day. Let's assassinate the Prophet. Let's kill the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ was made aware of this. He immediately got up and left. Okay, this was treason. Okay, they were banished from. They were allowed to leave, take whatever you want, leave, relocate. Huyay ibn Akhtab, he is the one who orchestrated the entire alliance against the Prophet ﷺ. And just to kind of keep it in the back of your head, he was the father-in-law later on of the Prophet ﷺ, Safiya bint Huyay. Okay, Safiya bint Huyay, radiyallahu ta'ala anha, al-Mu'mineen, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, daughter of Huyay ibn Akhtab. Wow. So Sirah is very interesting, y'all. I mean, the connections and the way things unfold, just like the Abu Sufyan, also the Prophet ﷺ's father-in-law. the father of Habiba. So subhanallah, when we talk about Sirah, it's so amazing, so interesting, how things kind of unfolded. One of the Jewish scholars who met with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his name is Abdullah ibn Salam, and I think we're gonna end it with the story of Abdullah ibn Salam. One such rabbi who accepted Islam was Abdullah ibn Salam radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. His original name was Hussein, okay, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam named him Abdullah after accepting Islam. He was actually from the descendants of Yusuf alayhi salam. There are some historians who mention that the Ansar altogether, like all of the Ansar, they were actual sons. Okay, they were descendants of the ulama of Bani Israel, and they were all from the lineage of Ishaq alayhi salam. So I mean, it goes all the way back then, Yaqub alayhi salam, as they all are. So they had settled there in anticipation to welcome the Prophet, and then over the years, children after children, generation after generation, and now you have the entire, all of the residents and the people who lived in Medina. So he was a descendant from Yusuf alayhi salam. He mentions that he had studied about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the last prophet. He had studied about his character. He had even studied his physical description, but he never shared it with anyone. He mentions that once upon a time I was on top of my date palm, and when the Prophet ﷺ came, when he got the news that the Prophet ﷺ entered Medina, he could not resist, and he just like off the top of his lungs shouted Allahu Akbar. And his own aunt made a remark that, hey, you looks like you wouldn't be as ecstatic to see Musa alayhi salam and happy to see Musa alayhi salam as you are to see Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, I'm going to share with you this hadith that Abdullah ibn Salam radiallahu anhu, in his own words, says that when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it looks like I'm looking the other way, right? So the screen is actually on this side, but it looks like I'm looking away from the screen, right? So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he arrived in Medina, the people came out to meet him, okay? It was said that the Prophet has arrived. So I went among the people to get a look at him, okay? He says, فلما استبنت وجه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عرفت أن وجهه ليس بوجه كذاب. When I gazed upon the face of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, right? Now imagine, he is anticipating for all this time. He had studied everything. He knew what's up. And when he saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he also knew what Quraysh and everyone was saying about him too, he said, I immediately realized that this was not the face of a liar. Okay, and the first thing that he heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, very famous hadith, that is the blueprint, the foundation of Muslim community, is the saying of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ayyuhan nas afshu salam, O people, spread salams, wa at'imu ta'am, and break bread with one another, have food together, say salams, share meals with one another, wa sallu wan nasu niyam, pray when people are sleeping, tadkhulul jannata bisalam, you will enter Jannah in peace. Okay, and it's amazing how his name was Abdullah bin Salam, and then the first words out of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's mouth he's hearing is afshu salam and tadkhulul jannata bisalam. Subhanallah. So this was in a nutshell, the early days of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam after migration. There are many other stories and events that happened in the month of Rabi Al-Thani. For example, one of the things that happened in the month of Rabi Al-Thani, which is a part of the early unfolding seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina, is the actual establishment of the brotherly ties, okay, amongst the Muhajirin and the Ansar. In the month of Rabi Al-Thani, we also remember the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's wife, al-Mu'minin Zainab bint Khuzaymah radiyallahu ta'ala anha. The Battle of Yarmouk also happened in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi in Rabi Al-Thani, the expedition of Usama ibn Zayd. Now this has to do with knowing a little bit more about Sirah when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was passed, before the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had passed away. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had made a call to send an expedition and a group to the Byzantine area, and that expedition, that arrangement, those troops were waiting right at the outskirts of Medina, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam departed and closed the curtains from the world, from his worldly life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there's that also took place. Abu Darda radiallahu anhu also passed away in the month of Rabi Al-Thani. So there are many significant events that happened in the month of Rabi Al-Thani. So inshallah, as time goes on, inshallah, we will start touching base on some of these. Thank you very much for joining us, and I pray and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He guides us towards what is better for us, and He accepts from us. And today, just to recap, we went over the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam stay at the house of Abu Ayyub radiallahu ta'ala anhu. We learn about his respect for the Prophet, his immense love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the hospitality that he extended to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We learn about the humble beginnings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's masjid. One of the things that I do want to share with you, inshallah, in the month of Rabi Al-Thani, if I get around to it, and when I get around to it, is the expansion, the history of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's masjid. The first expansion, which happened during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what happened or didn't happen during the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, then Umar radiallahu anhu, Uthman radiallahu anhu, and then so on and so forth, until we see the beautiful picture that we see today of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's masjid. Where is it? Let me see. Do I have that? And boom, there you go. Subhanallah, what a blessed place, what a blissful place, what a source of peace. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take me again and again, and all of us again and again, to meet the beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where we can present our salat and salam to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in person. Thank you very much, folks. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.